A man in a worn gray suit walked into the bank carrying a check worth $5 million. Within seconds, the branch manager laughed in front of the entire lobby, declared the check had to be fake, and tore it to pieces without hesitation. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved. Customers near the counter froze mid-conversation, phones halfway to pockets, coffee cups suspended in midair. But just as she turned to call security and have him removed, the private elevator doors slid open behind her. The bank president crossed the marble floor, looked at the man for exactly 3 seconds, then lowered his head and said, "Good morning, sir." The entire lobby went silent, the kind of silence that presses against the ears and makes people forget how to breathe, the kind that lingers long after the moment that caused it has passed. Nolan Avery drove a sedan that was well past its 10th year on the road. The paint faded near the wheel wells, the upholstery worn soft in the driver's seat from years of the same unhurried commute. He parked it 3 spaces down from a gleaming black luxury car, and did not seem to notice the difference, did not glance at it twice, did not adjust his posture the way some men might when standing beside something newer and shinier than what they owned. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet economy of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone in a room, though almost nobody in that room knew who he was or what that quiet actually concealed. He walked through the glass doors of the downtown branch, wearing a clean but clearly aged suit, the fabric slightly thin at the elbows, no watch on his wrist, no assistant trailing behind him, no security at his side, nothing that announced importance. The way people had come to expect importance to announce itself. Two tellers glanced at each other the moment he crossed the threshold, the kind of glance that carries a full conversation without a single word spoken, a silent exchange built entirely out of assumption. He did not look wealthy. He did not look important. He looked, to everyone in that lobby, like a man who had come to ask for something he could not afford, perhaps a payment extension, perhaps a favor, perhaps forgiveness. For a missed deadline on a loan, he was struggling to keep current. Nobody in that building, from the newest teller to the security guard stationed by the door, imagined for even a second that the man walking toward the counter controlled more wealth than everyone standing in that lobby combined. Behind the counter, an older teller named Denise had worked at that branch for nearly 11 years, long enough to develop her own quiet instincts about people, instincts built on genuine observation rather than assumption. She noticed the calm in Nolan's eyes, the way he stood with his weight evenly balanced, unhurried, unbothered by the weight. And something in her recognized that stillness as the mark of a man who had faced far greater pressures than a slow morning at a bank counter. She almost stepped forward to help him herself, but hesitated, glancing toward Victoria's office out of old habit, the kind of habit built over years of learning exactly whose approval mattered most inside those glass walls. Victoria Langford stepped out of her glass-walled office at the far end of the lobby, moving with the brisk confidence of someone who had spent years climbing toward a title and intended to defend it against anyone who threatened to make her look foolish for holding it. She was 39, sharp-featured, dressed in a tailored blazer that had cost more than most of her customers' monthly rent, her heels clicking against the marble, with the rhythm of a woman who believed every room she entered belonged to her by right. She had built her entire career on a simple, unspoken formula, one she had never once questioned in 15 years of climbing the corporate ladder. A person's appearance told you everything you needed to know about their worth, their reliability, and the amount of respect they deserved from the moment they stepped through the door. She looked at Nolan for less than 2 seconds and reached a verdict before he had said a single word to her or to anyone else behind the counter. In her mind, she had already sorted him into a familiar category, the kind of visitor who came in hoping to plead for a loan extension or beg off a missed payment, someone whose presence in her branch existed primarily as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a customer to be served. She felt the small, satisfied certainty of someone who believed she could read a stranger like a printed label, a certainty she had never once had reason to doubt, because nobody had ever forced her to confront how wrong that certainty could be. She turned back toward her office without offering so much as a greeting, leaving him standing near the entrance while 2 junior staff members exchanged uncertain looks over the counter. Nolan approached the counter without hurry, his voice even and unremarkable, and explained to the young teller that he needed to deposit a check and transfer the funds directly into a business account, a request so ordinary it should have taken no more than a few minutes to process from start to finish. It was, by any measure, the simplest kind of transaction a bank could receive on any given morning. But Victoria, watching from a few feet away through the glass wall of her office, instructed the staff through a quick, dismissive gesture to prioritize two other customers first: a well-dressed couple discussing an overseas wire transfer, and a man in an expensive wool coat inquiring about upgrading to a private banking tier reserved for higher net worth clients. Minutes passed. Nolan remained standing near the counter, patient, his hands folded loosely in front of him, watching the lobby's slow rhythm without any visible irritation crossing his face. The air around him thickened, though, with the particular discomfort of a room that senses something is wrong but has quietly decided not to name it out loud, the kind of tension that builds in silence and grows heavier with every past minute. A few customers glanced his way and then quickly looked elsewhere, unwilling to involve themselves in whatever was unfolding, unwilling to draw Victoria's sharp attention toward themselves for simply noticing. When his turn finally arrived, nearly 20 minutes after he had first stepped through the doors, he moved forward and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Withdrawing a plain white envelope, with the unhurried calm of a man accustomed to waiting far longer than this for far less important things, it was in that small motion, in the quiet unfolding of paper against the polished counter, that everything in the branch was about to change, though nobody standing there yet understood how completely. The young teller opened the envelope first, her fingers careful, and her eyes widened before she even managed to form a sentence. She turned the check around so that Victoria, now walking back toward the counter to see what was taking so long, could read the number printed there in plain, undeniable ink: $5 million. The figure sat on the paper with a kind of quiet authority that should have demanded immediate respect, immediate procedure, immediate professionalism from everyone standing behind that counter. Victoria let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed off the marble floor and carried easily to every corner of the lobby, the kind of laugh deliberately pitched to be heard by everyone within 30 feet of where she stood. She said, loudly enough, for the nearest customers to turn their heads, that the check had to be a fabrication, that anyone with a decent printer and a little patience could produce something convincing enough to fool an untrained eye. She claimed that forged documents walked through bank doors more often than most people realized, that scam artists grew bolder every year, and that she, personally, had developed an instinct for spotting them the moment they crossed the threshold. She held the check aloft, waving it slightly as though it were evidence in a trial rather than a legitimate financial instrument belonging to the man standing quietly in front of her. She passed it hand to hand among the tellers, encouraging them to examine it, to laugh along with her, to participate in what had quickly become a kind of public spectacle at Nolan's expense. One of the younger employees, caught up in the moment and eager to seem clever in front of her manager, quietly raised her phone and snapped a photograph of the check before anyone thought to stop her, the small click of the camera lost beneath the growing murmur of the crowd. Other customers near the entrance began drifting closer, drawn by the commotion, the way people are always drawn toward the possibility of watching someone else's humiliation unfold in real time. Whispers moved through the lobby like a current running just beneath the surface of the room, heads turning, voices lowering into speculation, the particular electric hum of a crowd that senses it is about to witness something worth talking about for the rest of the week. Nolan did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the check, did not lunge forward to snatch it back from the circle of tellers passing it between themselves. He simply asked, in the same even tone he had used since walking through the door nearly half an hour earlier, that the bank follow its standard verification procedure before making any public determination about the document's authenticity. It was a reasonable request, the kind any customer was entitled to make under any ordinary circumstance, and under ordinary circumstances it would have ended the entire matter within a matter of minutes, resolved quietly and professionally, the way such matters were designed to be resolved. But Victoria refused outright, and she made certain her refusal traveled clearly to the growing cluster of onlookers now gathering near the entrance. Several of them, already recording on their phones, capturing an interaction they sensed was building towards something they did not want to miss. "This bank does not have time for con artists," Victoria announced, loud enough that even the security guard stationed near the door turned his head to look. "I've seen enough of these to know exactly what I'm looking at." She straightened the collar of her blazer and glanced around at her audience with something close to pride, the posture of a woman who believed she was protecting her institution from an obvious threat rather than humiliating an innocent man in front of dozens of strangers. Nolan's expression did not change. He simply repeated his request, calm and unhurried, asking again that the matter be handled through proper channels rather than public theater. Victoria's patience, thin to begin with, seemed to evaporate entirely at the sound of him asking a second time. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, though it would replay in the memory of everyone present for a very long time afterward, retold and re-examined in break rooms and family dinners for weeks to come. Victoria, you the check, you the two tho, you three, you through, you three, 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 you three. Victoria again, and then again, reducing it to fragments too small to ever be reassembled into anything resembling proof, and she let the pieces fall from her fingers onto the counter and scatter across the polished floor below. "This bank does not exist to entertain scams," she said, her voice carrying easily across the marble expanse. "And it certainly doesn't exist to entertain people who think they can walk in off the street with a piece of forged paper and expect anyone here to take them seriously." 2 security guards, drawn by the sudden commotion, began moving toward the counter, with the measured caution of men uncertain whether they were about to break up an argument or escort someone out entirely. Several customers near the entrance had already lifted their phones fully into recording position, capturing the scraps of torn paper scattered across the floor, capturing the stunned and motionless figure of the man standing above them, capturing a moment none of them yet understood the true weight of. Nolan looked down at the torn fragments for a long moment, his face unreadable, and when he finally spoke, his voice had not changed at all. It remained calm, unhurried, carrying none of the panic or anger the room seemed to be waiting for, almost hoping for, the way a crowd sometimes hopes for a story to escalate rather than resolve. "Are you certain this is the decision you want to make?" he asked, the question landing in the silence with more weight than its simple words seemed to carry. Victoria answered instantly, her chin lifted, her voice dripping with a confidence that would not survive the next 60 seconds of her life. "More certain than I've ever been about anything," she said, and a few of the onlookers actually laughed at the sharpness of her reply, emboldened by her certainty, some of them already anticipating the satisfaction of watching a stranger escorted out of the building in front of everyone. It was at that exact moment, as the security guards closed the final few feet of distance between themselves and the counter, that the soft electronic chime of the private elevator sounded from the far wall, and its polished steel doors began, slowly, to part. Richard Ellison stepped out of the elevator with the unhurried authority of a man who owned the building he was standing in, which, in a manner of speaking, he very nearly did. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that fit with the precision of decades spent in boardrooms rather than showrooms, and the moment his eyes found the man standing at the counter, something shifted visibly across his face, a flicker of surprise, followed almost instantly by something closer to alarm. He crossed the lobby in long, purposeful strides that closed the distance in a matter of seconds, ignoring the confused glances of his own staff, ignoring the security guards who stepped aside instinctively to let him pass. When he reached Nolan, he extended both hands to take Nolan's in a grip reserved for people whose decisions could reshape an institution overnight. "Sir Avery," Richard said, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire lobby to hear clearly. "I had absolutely no idea you were visiting us this morning. Please, forgive the wait, and please forgive whatever has happened here." Victoria's face drained of color so quickly that one of the tellers instinctively reached out a hand toward her, as though bracing to catch her should her legs actually give way beneath her. The rest of the staff, who moments earlier had been either watching the spectacle with amusement or actively participating in it, straightened where they stood, the casual mockery of a minute ago replaced instantly by a stiff, uncertain, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on the entire lobby at once. Richard turned, scanning the counter and the marble floor around it, and his gaze landed on the scattered white fragments, still resting where they had fallen only moments earlier. He asked, evenly, but with a hard edge beneath the calm, exactly who had been assisting Mr. Avery this morning, and precisely what had happened to the document now lying in pieces at his feet. Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession, heavy and damning, until Richard's eyes moved slowly across the frozen faces of his staff, past the tellers, past the security guards, and settled, inevitably, and without mercy, on Victoria standing rigid near the counter. Richard turned to Nolan first, his voice low and urgent now, offering an apology that came without hesitation or qualification, the kind of apology a man gives when he understands exactly how much is at stake and has no interest in softening it with excuses or half measures. "Whatever happened here this morning," he said quietly, "I take full responsibility for it, and I promise you it will be handled properly, immediately, and completely." Victoria, still reeling from the sight of her president, bowing his head to a man she had spent the last half hour humiliating, told herself there had to be some mistake, that perhaps this stranger was simply an old acquaintance of Richard's, someone he felt obligated to greet warmly out of personal history rather than any real professional significance. She clung to that idea for only a few more seconds, the last fragile seconds in which her old assumptions still felt like they might hold any weight at all. Richard did not let her keep them for long. He turned to face the lobby, straightened to his full height, and in clear, deliberate words, meant to travel to every corner of the room, told them exactly who Nolan Avery was, sparing no detail that might have softened the impact of what his staff had just done. "This is Nolan Avery," he said, "chairman of Avery Meridian Capital, one of the largest private investment funds this bank has ever worked with, a man who personally oversees a portfolio worth several $100 million, and a man who, until this exact moment, has remained almost entirely unknown by face to the very branch responsible for handling his transactions." Gasps rippled through the crowd gathered near the entrance, several phones lowering slowly, as the recording customers realized they had captured something far bigger than a simple public dispute. Several of the tellers exchanged looks of pure disbelief, as though they had just watched a magic trick performed in reverse. The ordinary suddenly and violently revealed as extraordinary, the man they had mocked only minutes earlier, now standing revealed as someone whose signature alone could shift the fortunes of the entire branch. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, some instinct urging her toward an explanation, an apology, anything at all, but found that nothing useful came out, her voice catching somewhere in her throat where her confidence used to live. Richard, without waiting for her response, turned to his assistant and instructed her to pull the security footage from the last 15 minutes and have it ready for review in the main conference room within 5 minutes, his tone leaving no room whatsoever for delay or negotiation. He then turned back to Nolan, his expression a careful mixture of professional composure and genuine personal mortification, and asked quietly whether he would be willing to step upstairs while the matter was properly addressed. Nolan nodded once, calm as he had been from the very beginning, and followed Richard toward the same elevator that had delivered him only moments before, leaving behind a lobby full of people who would spend the rest of the day quietly retelling what they had just witnessed to anyone who would listen. Within minutes, the footage was playing on the large screen mounted in the executive conference room, and every angle told the same unforgiving story without a single frame offering Victoria any room for interpretation or excuse. There was Nolan stepping through the doors nearly 40 minutes earlier, patient and unassuming, his posture calm, even as the staff glanced at each other with obvious suspicion. There was Victoria dismissing him with a glance, prioritizing other customers ahead of him, making him wait while she attended to people whose clothing had earned her instant approval and easy smiles. There was the check, presented politely, examined with visible contempt, laughed at and passed hand to hand among a staff more interested in mockery than procedure. And then, in stark, undeniable clarity, there was the moment Victoria tore the check into pieces while declaring, loudly and publicly, that the bank had no room for scams or for people like him, her voice sharp and clear on the recording, every word captured with perfect fidelity by the overhead microphones. There was no ambiguity anywhere in the footage, no angle that offered her the slightest excuse, nothing left open to interpretation or defense of any kind. Richard watched the entire recording without speaking, his jaw tightening more with every passing second, and when it finally ended, the silence in the conference room felt even heavier than the one that had settled over the lobby only minutes before. Miriam Cole entered the conference room just as the footage reached its final, damning seconds, arriving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been summoned mid-morning and had not wasted a moment getting there. She watched the last few frames in complete silence before turning to address the room, her expression carefully controlled but unmistakably grim. At 52, she had spent nearly 2 decades in internal compliance, and she carried the particular weight of someone who had seen every conceivable kind of institutional failure and had long ago stopped being surprised by any of them, though her tightened expression made clear this particular failure still troubled her more than most. "I want her system access suspended immediately," Miriam said, her voice flat and businesslike, allowing no room for argument. "I want her employee credentials collected before she leaves this building. And I want a formal incident report opened before the end of the day, documenting every single detail visible in that footage." Victoria began to protest, her voice rising with a note of desperation that had not been present in her earlier, easy confidence. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "I was following the exact protocols this bank has always used for unverified documents. I was protecting the institution." But the words came out fractured and unconvincing, tripping over themselves. And somewhere in the middle of her own sentence, she seemed to realize that no explanation she offered was going to change what everyone in that room had just watched with their own eyes on a screen that did not lie. Richard waited until the room had settled into an uneasy quiet before he revealed the fuller picture, the context that made the morning's events even more consequential than anyone standing in that lobby earlier had possibly understood. Nolan, he explained, had not announced his visit in advance, had not requested any special treatment or preferential handling, and had chosen this particular branch at random, precisely because he wanted to observe, without warning or performance, how an ordinary customer would be treated on an ordinary weekday morning. The reason behind that decision mattered enormously, far more than anyone in the room had guessed. Avery Meridian Capital was in the final stages of considering a strategic partnership with the bank, an investment commitment worth several $100 million, one that would have reshaped the institution's standing in the industry for the next decade or longer. This branch, out of dozens scattered across the region, had simply been the one Nolan walked into that particular morning, chosen with no more significance than the flip of a coin, and within the span of 20 minutes, Victoria had managed to jeopardize the entire arrangement, with nothing more than her own assumptions and her own casual, public cruelty. The room absorbed this revelation in heavy silence. Several employees, now visibly shaken by the sheer scale of what had nearly been lost over a single act of contempt, directed at a stranger who had done nothing to deserve it. Richard turned back to Nolan, his voice steady but unmistakably tense, and asked plainly what he wanted done. Prepared, it seemed, to accept almost any consequence the man might demand, including the immediate and total collapse of the partnership discussions that had taken months to reach this stage. Nolan considered the question for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for an answer that everyone assumed would arrive sharp with retribution, cold, with the satisfaction of finally having the upper hand. Nobody in that room, not Richard, not Miriam, not the shame-faced staff members waiting anxiously outside the door, expected what came next, and the wait itself stretched the silence into something almost unbearable, thick enough to feel against the skin. Most of the people in that conference room, and certainly Victoria herself, braced for a response built on retaliation, the kind of reckoning that would end careers, generate headlines, and leave nothing standing in its wake but the wreckage of a lesson learned too late. Instead, Nolan spoke slowly, choosing his words with the same unhurried care he had shown from the moment he walked through the bank's front doors nearly an hour earlier. "I don't want anyone else treated the way I was treated this morning," he said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to land harder than any threat could have possibly landed, harder than any demand for punishment or public reckoning. He was not asking for an apology alone, and he was not asking for Victoria's career as some kind of symbolic sacrifice offered up to soothe his own pride. What he wanted was structural, something that would outlast this single incident and reach every branch operating under the bank's name, something built to prevent this exact scene from ever repeating itself against some other quiet, unassuming stranger. He asked for a complete overhaul of how customers were greeted and assessed, regardless of how they were dressed or what kind of vehicle they had parked outside. He asked for mandatory training on unconscious bias for every employee who interacted with the public, delivered not as a hollow checkbox exercise completed once and forgotten, but as something the institution genuinely committed to reinforcing year after year. He asked that no employee ever again be permitted to publicly declare a customer's documents fraudulent without first following verification procedures designed for exactly this purpose, procedures that existed precisely to prevent moments like the one that had just unfolded downstairs. And he asked for a public acknowledgement of what had happened that morning, not buried quietly in an internal memo circulated among executives, but delivered honestly and openly to the people who had witnessed it firsthand. Richard agreed to every single condition without hesitation, his voice steady with the visible relief of a man who had feared losing far more than he ultimately had to give up in exchange for keeping the partnership alive. "Every condition," he said, "will be met, and I'll personally oversee the implementation myself, starting today." Somewhere near the back of the room, Victoria began to cry, quietly at first, and then without any restraint left to hold it back, the sound of someone confronting the full weight of a mistake that could never be undone with an apology alone, no matter how sincerely offered. Nobody moved to comfort her. Nobody moved to condemn her further either. The room simply let her sit with it, the tears less about the man she had wronged in the lobby downstairs, and more, it seemed, about the sudden and total collapse of every assumption she had built her identity upon for 15 years. The belief that she could measure a person's worth by the cut of their suit and the weight of their watch and the sound of their voice. Nolan did not look at her with anger, not even in that moment when her tears might have felt, to some, like an invitation to finally deliver the harsh words she seemed to be bracing for. He looked at her, if anything, with something closer to weariness, the tired recognition of a pattern he had encountered more times in his life than he cared to count, a pattern that had followed him through boardrooms and airports and hotel lobbies for as long as he could remember, one that no amount of wealth or achievement had ever fully managed to erase. He thought, briefly, of the years before Avery Meridian Capital existed, back when he was a young analyst walking into interviews wearing the only suit he owned, watching interviewers glance at his resume, and then at his face with a flicker of confusion they never quite managed to hide. He remembered being followed through department stores by security guards who assumed his presence meant trouble, rather than simply meant a customer with money to spend. None of that history excused what Victoria had done in the lobby that morning, and none of it made her tears easier to watch, but it did explain, at least to himself, why he had chosen patience over punishment when the moment finally arrived for him to decide what happened next. Miriam remained in the conference room after the others had filed out, arranging the paperwork that would formalize Victoria's termination, and she found herself thinking about how many similar mornings must have unfolded quietly across the bank's network over the years, unnoticed, unrecorded, unremarkable enough that nobody with real power had ever happened to be standing nearby to witness them. She made a private note to review complaint records going back several years, suspecting, with a compliance officer's practiced pessimism, that this was not the first time something like this had happened, only the first time it had happened to someone impossible to ignore. The bank's executive board convened an emergency session within 48 hours of the incident, and the outcome was decided, with a speed that reflected exactly how seriously the institution now understood the stakes to be, not just financially, but reputationally. Victoria Langford was removed from her position effective immediately, her termination accompanied by a formal investigation into procedural violations that extended well beyond the events of that single, catastrophic morning. She was held financially accountable for the destruction of a negotiable financial instrument, a consequence that carried both legal and reputational weight far beyond anything she had anticipated when she first tore the check into pieces in front of dozens of witnesses. Every employee across the bank's entire network, not just the downtown branch where the incident had occurred, was required to complete updated training on customer service standards and unconscious bias before the month was out, with no exceptions granted regardless of seniority, tenure, or position within the company. A formal letter of apology was carefully drafted and sent to Nolan under Richard's own signature, though everyone involved understood that no letter, however well written, could fully undo the humiliation of standing in a public lobby while a stranger tore apart proof of his own legitimacy in front of dozens of strangers holding up their phones. Still, the bank's leadership treated the moment with all the seriousness it demanded, and slowly, deliberately, the institution's reputation began to recover from what could very easily have become a public catastrophe, capable of unraveling decades of carefully built trust. News of the incident spread quietly through internal channels at first, then eventually beyond them, and rather than becoming a story of scandal and collapse, it gradually became something the bank, somewhat uncomfortably, used as a case study in exactly what not to do, and exactly how much a single moment of contempt could cost an institution that prided itself on trust and discretion. Training sessions across the company began referencing the incident directly, without naming Victoria, but describing in careful detail the exact chain of assumptions that had led to such a public and preventable failure. New hires were shown a sanitized version of the security footage during their first week of orientation, watching in uncomfortable silence, as a manager tore apart a legitimate financial instrument based on nothing more than the way a customer happened to be dressed that morning. Trainers used the footage to walk through each individual decision point where the outcome could have shifted, each moment where a simple pause, a simple question, a simple ounce of patience might have prevented the entire catastrophe from ever unfolding in the first place. News of what happened at the downtown branch eventually reached other financial institutions across the city, carried through the informal networks that connect executives and compliance officers who rarely admit how closely they watch each other's failures. Several competing banks quietly reviewed their own customer service protocols in the weeks that followed, unwilling to risk becoming the subject of the next story, whispered across industry conferences and closed-door meetings. Richard received 2 phone calls from counterparts at rival institutions, both framed as friendly check-ins, both clearly fishing for details about exactly how close the bank had come to losing a partnership worth several $100 million over a single employee's misjudgment. 1 month later, the downtown branch looked, on the surface, almost exactly as it had before the incident. The same marble floors polished to the same careful shine, the same glass-walled offices catching the same morning light, the same steady rhythm of customers moving through its doors each weekday morning. But something fundamental beneath that familiar surface had shifted in ways that were impossible to miss once you knew what to look for. Every employee greeted every customer with the same measured warmth now, regardless of the condition of their clothing or the make and model of the car they had parked outside in the lot. Nobody skipped a line based on appearance any longer, not even for the customers who arrived in obviously expensive coats or carrying obviously expensive handbags. Nobody whispered judgments behind a raised hand near the counter, and nobody laughed loudly enough to be heard across the lobby at the expense of a stranger simply trying to complete an ordinary transaction. The staff had learned, through consequence, rather than through any gentle suggestion or optional workshop, that dignity was not something to be rationed out carefully according to perceived wealth or status, that respect was owed equally to every person who walked through those glass doors, regardless of what they carried in their pockets. Richard made a point of thanking Nolan personally when the 2 men met again, this time in the calm privacy of the executive office rather than the chaos of a crowded lobby filled with recording phones and whispered speculation. Nolan signed the new investment agreement that day, formalizing the partnership that had so nearly been destroyed by a single act of arrogance directed at exactly the wrong person But before he did, he offered Richard a thought that the older man would carry with him for the rest of his career in banking. "I'm not investing because of the marble floors," Nolan said, glancing briefly around the polished office. "And I'm not investing because of the impressive titles printed on everyone's business cards throughout this building." He paused for a moment, choosing his next words with the same deliberate care he brought to everything he said. "I'm investing because, on that one particular morning, an institution was forced to learn, in the most public and painful way possible, how to treat a human being with respect before it ever thought to check the balance of his accounts. That lesson is worth more to me than any return this partnership could ever generate." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that statement, and admitted quietly that he had thought about that morning almost every single day since it happened, replaying the footage in his mind, wondering how many other customers over the years might have walked through those doors and been treated with the same casual contempt Victoria had shown. Nolan, simply because nobody with enough power in the room had happened to walk out of an elevator at the right moment to stop it. He confessed that the incident had changed the way he moved through his own institution, that he now made a habit of walking the lobby floor himself several mornings a week, unannounced, dressed down, simply watching how his staff treated the ordinary flow of customers when they believed no one important was paying attention. It had become, in its own strange way, a kind of penance, though he never used that word out loud to anyone, preferring instead to describe it simply as good management. Nolan listened without comment, recognizing in Richard's quiet discomfort the same weight he himself had carried for years, the difference being that Richard was only now beginning to understand what it meant to walk through the world uncertain of how a stranger might treat him. The final image, weeks later, showed an ordinary customer stepping through the same glass doors that had once framed the beginning of the entire incident. A man dressed simply, carrying nothing that announced wealth or status, the same kind of visitor Victoria might once have dismissed, with a glance and a raised eyebrow, before turning back toward her office without a second thought. A young teller, newly trained and visibly earnest, looked up from her station and greeted him with a warm and unhurried smile that carried no trace of judgment or suspicion. "Good morning, sir," she said. "How can we help you today?" The simple, ordinary courtesy of the greeting seemed to fill the entire lobby with something lighter than it had held a month earlier, something that felt, finally, like the institution it had always claimed to be. Outside, beyond the glass, a familiar figure paused for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the exchange unfold through the window, with something quiet and satisfied settling into his expression, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Then Nolan Avery turned, adjusted the collar of his still unremarkable coat, and walked on, unnoticed once again by the world moving busily around him, exactly as he preferred it to be. A person's worth was never written on the surface of their clothing, and it was never written in the color of their skin either, no matter how many people throughout history had convinced themselves otherwise. No title, no watch, no polished pair of shoes could ever substitute for the truth of who someone actually was underneath the surface details that strangers used again and again to sort each other into categories before a single word had even been exchanged. When arrogance was allowed to lead judgment, it inevitably built its conclusions on sand, certain of itself, right up until the exact moment the ground gave way beneath it without warning. It took the quiet, unhurried arrival of truth, and the harder, slower work of genuine respect, to rebuild what careless contempt had shattered in the space of a single, unforgivable minute inside a crowded lobby. And somewhere in that lesson lived the only real measure that ever truly mattered, the simple, stubborn insistence that every person, regardless of what they carried or wore or drove into the parking lot that morning, deserved to be seen and heard and treated with basic human dignity before they were ever judged by anything else at all.